wanted to create their own horror movie. It's beyond rage. There is some kind of message being sent with this murder. Someone who may appear very normal can snap and commit a murder, even one this brutal.
One wonders, is this a type of sexual obsession that is partly driving this offense?
You're holding your breath, fearful for what you might just see on this videotape.
They wanted to have everlasting fame and terror associated with their names.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Pocatello, Idaho, a town where locals pride themselves on knowing right from wrong.
It is a railroad town. It is also a town that has Idaho State University, so it is a college town. So it is blue collar meets white collar, and it's not like many communities where you don't know your neighbors. I grew up in Pocatello. It's just one of those good places, still is, to live, and raise a family. The majority of crime is property-based crime, thefts, and you'll get the occasional vandalism or sometimes a stolen vehicle. We did occasionally get, a homicide. Those are not very common.
On a peaceful Sunday afternoon, an alarming call comes into 911 from longtime Pocatello resident, Allison Contreras.
Honey, hey, breathing. Okay, hon, we're gonna get him coming, okay?
Allison Contreras, her husband and their family, they'd been gone for the weekend. They came home Sunday afternoon, came in and found her niece, Cassie, lying on the living room floor, covered in blood and unresponsive. So we hopped into our patrol cars and headed straight for the scene.
When police arrive, Allison directs them to the living room, where they discover the body of her niece, Cassie Jo Stoddard.
She was lying in front of the couch, a lot of blood around her, and multiple stab wounds. All a very brutal, very aggressive, very deadly attack. This only happens in bigger cities. This doesn't happen in Pocatello, Idaho.
The initial investigators that went into the residence, when they observed the body, they could see some obvious signs of self-defense wounds.
Her pinky finger was nearly severed from her hand, trying to defend herself from this very brutal attack that she was enduring. There was spatter on the television, high-velocity blood thrown onto the walls. That's indicative of someone flinging their knife backwards and then coming down again very fast. It speaks to the violence of the attack.
In fact, there were 31 stab wounds to her body, 12 of which were fatal wounds. And when you're dealing with an individual that was stabbed 31 times, this is a crime of violence. This isn't just something that happened. This is a premeditated, violent act committed against this young woman.
This is a frenzy murder. It's beyond rage. There is some kind of message being sent with this murder to create the most horrific tableau imaginable for whoever's going to find that body.
Cassie's mother, Anna, arrives on the scene. She can't imagine who would have wanted to kill her daughter so savagely.
Cassie was a 16-year-old young woman that had high aspirations. She had aspirations of going to law school and possibly being a prosecuting attorney, possibly being a veterinarian. The world was at her fingertips.
She was very interested in art and those sorts of things, but also Cassie was known to have compassion. She was a defender of the people who were looked down upon by others. She was very passionate about the things in life that she felt strongly about and was not afraid to take a stand. She was very, mature for 16. And in life, she was going to do something that would matter.
Tasked with investigating the brutal murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard are Detective Robert Rausch and prosecuting attorney Vic Pearson.
I have a son that's the same age. He's born right in the same group with Cassie, and it makes it even harder for me as a parent to investigate a murder. You have to distance yourself, and at the same time it's hard when you're looking at this and you're looking at people who have lost someone that's the same age and the same point in life that your child is. You just can't make any sense of this.
To track down Cassie's killer, investigators will need to unravel the final 24 hours of her life.
We find a phone next to Cassie's body, and in case someone called, we don't know for sure, but it is something else that we would look at closely for fingerprints. Footprints are in the area around Cassie's body, and they go across the carpet and through the garage, across the garage, and then outside from the garage. The trail terminates out there in the gravel and grass. In this case, what appears to be one lone set of footprints, bloody footprints leading away, initially points in the direction of a single attacker.
Investigators follow the footprints down to the basement.
Downstairs around the corner, there's the breaker box. Some of the breakers are still thrown, including the breakers for upstairs for the phone and the TV and that, right where Cassie was. So, who was in the breaker box? Why were they in the breaker box? We needed to get some fingerprints and figure out whose hands had been on that box.
As they continue to search the crime scene, investigators consider if they could be looking at a burglary gone wrong.
The home did not appear to be ransacked or like a robbery gone wild. It seemed a very focused attack.
This wasn't a forced entry. Somebody had either come in through an unlocked door or had been invited in.
And then, detectives find a piece of evidence that paints a different picture of the crime.
We discover a discarded condom in the bathroom. It is absolutely a possible theory that Cassie was sexually assaulted and that perhaps she was killed to keep her quiet. It's something that you have to kind of carry forward and say, okay, we might possibly be looking for someone who would have this kind of fixation on her. We also, of course, look at boyfriends and other people close to her.
To check their theory against the forensic evidence, investigators turn to the medical examiner.
We complete a sexual assault kit, and we do find that there had been sexual activity. But we don't know whether this was consensual sexual activity or forced sexual activity.
The medical examiner also helps establish Cassie's window of death.
She has a bloated stomach, and she has rigor mortis. It tells us she's been deceased for a while. Time of death was thought to be either early Saturday sometime or late Friday.
To continue building the victim's timeline, investigators turn their attention to Cassie's mother, Anna Stoddard.
So Anna relays that Cassie was house sitting for her aunt and uncle. They have some dogs and cats, and she was going to house sit with them. And she was going to get there Friday, which she did, and was going to stay until Sunday evening when the Contrerases were due home.
On Friday night, Anna gave Cassie permission to invite her boyfriend, Scott, over to the
She tells us that she dropped off Cassie and Scott at the Contreras' home, 5:30 p.m. on Friday. Later that evening, Anna had called Cassie to see how she was doing, and Cassie told her that she had had some problems with the phone and some problems with the power going out, but things were okay, and she was doing fine. Scott was there with her. Anna felt that these little things didn't really seem to have Cassie scared that much. They were just kind of inconveniences to her.
When Anna is unable to reach Cassie on Sunday, she goes to the Contreras house to check on her, only to learn that she's been brutally murdered.
Anna arrives at the scene shortly after Cassie's body is found, and she calls Scott, and she says, "What the F did you do to my daughter?"
To Anna's knowledge, the last person with Cassie was Scott. And so, in her mind, I'm sure that's what she was thinking is, you were the last person with my daughter, and now my daughter's dead. What did you do to my daughter?
Police have their first suspect in the vicious slaying of 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddard, her boyfriend, and the last person to see her alive. Scott Linderholm.
We have to focus on what we have in front of us, look at all the pieces, and Scott is a piece at this time. And he also has an emotional attachment, their boyfriend, girlfriend. We discovered, that in the 5 months that they had been dating, they'd have occasionally a spat here and there. It didn't seem too out of line for a normal teen relationship. But we understand that someone who may appear very normal, otherwise, under the right circumstances, can snap and commit a murder, and even one this brutal.
Talking to Cassie's family, there were a few things about Scott and Cassie's relationship that worried us. There had been a couple instances where Scott had been argumentative and rude towards Cassie and her family. Anna and Cassie had had a couple recent arguments regarding Cassie and Scott's relationship. Anna didn't necessarily approve of Scott as a good boyfriend for Cassie, just based upon some of their interactions between each other. The question becomes motive. Did something happen between them on that particular evening that caused a fight?
When you're younger, you don't think as much about consequences, so pressures like rejection can be especially traumatic. Older people might say, well, there's other fish in the sea, where young people, this is the only fish in the sea.
Scott, when he's first interviewed, you'd expect him to be extremely emotional, extremely upset, but he wasn't, and this was out of the ordinary.
You don't seem too busted up about this thing. Well, what's going on there? I've had, there's been, so many deaths in our family, her dad died, her brother died. I've just been to, so many funerals, and, stuff like that. I'm, kind of used to death.
Scott was asked about the condom found in the toilet, and he was quite embarrassed, nervous, and kind of, overwhelmed by the situation. But he was quick to point out that the sexual relations with he and Cassie were consensual and that they had occurred. As he is answering questions, you're looking at subtle changes in body language. If he displays emotion, is it appropriate emotion? Because it's hard for someone to keep up a front, especially for a crime like this, which takes an intense amount of rage and an intense amount of some sort of emotion that the rest of us don't normally have to do something like this.
Detectives drill down on Scott's alibi. During the window of time Cassie was murdered.
Scott relayed that Anna had driven them out to the Contreras home and dropped him off about 5:30 p.m. Scott called two of his friends, Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper, to come over and watch a movie with him, spend some time. Scott describes Brian and Tori as friends of his, guys he hangs out with at school every so often. According to Scott, Cassie was not happy at all that he had called and let Brian and Tori know that this is where they were going to be. She really didn't want him to, because she wanted to have just a nice, easy, quiet evening with her boyfriend. But Cassie is very nice to everyone. And so she tolerates a lot because these are Scott's friends.
At approximately 8:20 p.m., Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had arrived at their residence.
Cassie takes them on a tour of the house, ending in the basement.
Brian, Tori, and Scott went around. They messed around on some gym equipment.
They were immature to her, so it was less of a fun time together, more of a babysitting venture. And then they went upstairs to watch a movie, Kill Bill 2. But Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had not stayed for the whole movie. About 9:45, they had decided that they were going to leave to go watch a movie in a theater.
They actually asked if Scott wanted to go with them, but he said he was going to stay with Cassie, and so they left the residence at that time. Lights go out at the house. Him and Cassie start hearing some strange sounds coming from the basement.
They're not 100% sure what's going on, and this goes on for a while.
The lights start going off and on, and they're starting to get worried. They have some dogs in the house that are barking at the top of the stairs, So there's a lot of things going through their minds. Certainly fear is one of them. And then the power comes back on, and Scott makes a determination that he's going to call his mother to pick him up. Approximately 11:20, Scott's parents arrive at the house. The lights had been back on, so nothing was out of the ordinary at that point.
Scott then says he went home and watched movies with his dad from 11:40 p.m. until they went to bed at 3 a.m.
Scott did say that he called multiple times on Saturday and couldn't get a hold of Cassie, and that they'd spoke daily. So this was very odd for him.
But instead of going over to check on Cassie by himself, Scott meets his buddy, Tori Adamczyk.
Tori comes over and picks him up in the evening, around 7. They go back to Tori's house. Tori tells him that he can't take him over there to Cassie's place, which, granted, is across town. He says because he doesn't have enough gas in his car and he needs to save the gas he has in his car. And so, they never do get to go over there and check on her on Saturday night. Why didn't Scott ask Tori's mom and dad if they would take him over there, or see if he could put some more gas in Tori's car?
Sometimes people feign concern to show themselves as not somebody capable of committing such an act. It is designed to throw the police off their scent.
To corroborate Scott's story, detectives reach out to his parents.
Both of Scott's parents said that they picked him up at the Contreras house at 11:20 p.m. on Friday night, and both of them gave exactly the same version of the events.
But Scott's parents don't enter the house. They call him on the phone, and Scott just exits the house and comes outside. So they never see Cassie on that particular evening.
Scott was the only person with Cassie from 9:45 until 11:20. That provided him the opportunity to have committed this crime.
And focus on the two boys who were at the house the night of the murder.
The initial interview with Tori is just essentially establishing whether or not Scott's story has credibility. And then also because he and Brian were also in the vicinity, at least up till 9:45. His demeanor is sort of caught between nervousness and almost a form of hero worship, because we have a position of power. Tori did express that he not only knew Cassie, but knew her pretty well and had known her for years.
How often do you see her, maybe during a week?
Every day at school.
And thought that she was a very smart and very beautiful young lady. It very much did seem like he had a crush on Cassie, and he feels bad for what happened to her.
Investigators home in on Tori's timeline for the night of the murder.
Tori stated that he picked up Brian and went to the house. We got there at 8:20. He had originally been told by Scott that this was going to be a party, and when nobody else came over, it kind of bummed him out. They hung around for a little while. They had popsicles, which Scott had opened up with a box opener kind of knife.
Tori claims the four of them went back upstairs and put on a movie. But he and Brian weren't that interested.
They'd already seen Kill Bill, and then they decided they wanted to go see something else. This wasn't going to be a party, and so it was time to go at that point.
We asked him what movie he went to, and he advises he went to a show called Pulse until 11:45, and then returned home after watching that movie.
Brian had spent the night. They were watching another movie at Tori's house, and then they'd went to bed, and Brian had left about 10:30 on Saturday morning.
Police asked Tori if anyone can back up his alibi.
We talked to his parents, and Tori had went up to his parents to apologize for getting in at midnight because he was supposed to be home at 11, and went to bed. As we're examining what Tori is telling us, and we're comparing that to what Scott is telling us, it is kind of striking that they both have such a well put together alibi for Friday night, and then they spent Saturday night together. And we still had questions about why Scott didn't press harder to check on Cassie. There is that possibility that both Scott and Tori could be part of some sort of conspiracy in relation to this crime. So absolutely, we need to talk to Brian Draper.
Detectives have zeroed in on 3 persons of interest in the murder of 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddard. Her boyfriend, Scott.
During Brian Draper's interview, he was a little bit more scared in the moment, a little more nervous in the moment.
You know, as you well know, you're one of the last 3 people, you know, to see Cassie.
When asked about his relationship with Cassie, he talks about knowing her for quite a while, and he did also speak kindly of her in terms of what kind of person she was. He did describe her as a friend.
Knowing Scott and Tori's versions of events, investigators questioned Brian about his whereabouts the night Cassie was murdered.
Brian relayed essentially the same time frame of events that Tori did for Friday night. Brian also relayed that Scott had a knife and he got out and played with it a little bit. When we asked Brian about going to the movie, Brian relayed to us that he had run into a friend named Heather, chatted with her for a few minutes before he went into the movie.
Brian also tells the same story about staying over at Tori's house and leaving at 10:30 Saturday morning.
When we're comparing Brian's story to Tori's story, they're relatively consistent, so we have no reason to necessarily suspect that they committed this crime.
Tori and Brian's alibis show they did not have the opportunity to kill Cassie, and they are eliminated as suspects. Then, the forensic results come in, and they swing the case in a whole new direction.
Cassie's mother has a boyfriend named Ralph, and on the breaker box, we found Ralph's fingerprints. Now we certainly know that there could have been some opportunity to commit this crime against Cassie. We don't have any specific motive of why Ralph would have wanted to commit a crime like this. There's the typical situations that people think of with a boyfriend of the mother, and maybe there's some strained relationship in that respect that he wants to keep secret.
Investigators haul Ralph down to the station for questioning.
Ralph tells us that they've lived together for a period of time and they have a good relationship. But Ralph's relationship with Cassie wasn't always the best because it's not Dad, but it's somebody that's kind of playing that father figure.
Detectives ask Ralph why his fingerprints were found on the breaker box.
What we find is that Ralph did some work for the Contrerases and had been in the breaker box.
Does that mean that he didn't commit the crime on that evening? No, but at least we know there's one reason for his fingerprints to be there already.
Still suspicious, investigators ask Ralph to submit to a polygraph examination.
We ask Ralph something to do with the death of Cassie.
But the polygraph results indicate there's some deception in Ralph's answers.
That causes the hair on the back of our neck to stand up just a little bit taller.
With Ralph now the prime suspect in Cassie's murder, detectives take a closer look at his timeline.
Ralph tells us that he was working until 7 p.m. And then he has dinner with Anna till approximately 9:30. And at 9:30 p.m., he goes to a neighbor's house where he played video games till approximately 1:30 in the morning.
Police work to verify Ralph's alibi for the night of Cassie's murder.
So we go ask that neighbor, was Ralph with you from 9:30 to 1:30? And the neighbor does tell us he was with us at that particular point. Then we talk to Anna, and Anna says, yeah, Ralph arrived back home at 1:30. So we have verified that the story Ralph's given us is the truth.
With no opportunity to commit the crime, Ralph is cleared as a suspect. And the investigation into the murder of Cassie Stoddard hits a wall.
Right now, we just know that there's a killer on the loose. We have nobody in custody, and we have a 16-year-old girl that's been stabbed to death brutally. And so we have our work cut out for us.
The small town of Pocatello, Idaho, has been rocked by the senseless murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard. With a killer on the loose, locals fear could strike again.
There was a tremendous reaction throughout the community. This is not supposed to happen to a 16-year-old. And when the method of death came out, that was additionally extraordinary to the community. They could not imagine somebody having this kind of rage. You just don't expect this kind of thing to happen. And so I think that really sent a chill up a lot of people, up their spines for sure.
When you listen to some of the behaviors that are described here as part of this crime, one wonders, is this a type of sexual obsession, some sort of sexual desire towards Cassie that hasn't been realized that is partly driving this offense?
Police turn to Cassie's friends, searching for anyone who could fit the profile of an obsessed killer. They start by interviewing her friend Heather.
Heather relayed to us that she felt there was fairly common knowledge that Tori had a crush on Cassie. She says that Tori was obsessed with knives and talked about his collection of knives at school, and that Tori
Likes movies. He likes a particular genre of movies, that being slasher films. And so that becomes a red flag for us.
Investigators ask Heather about seeing Tori and Brian at the movies the night Cassie was killed. She makes a startling revelation.
Heather said that she had not, in fact, spoken with Brian Draper that night at the movie theater, like Brian had told us that he had.
To get to the truth, officers bring Brian in for a second interview.
When we interviewed Brian Draper about going to the movie, we asked him questions about the plot of the movie, and he was very vague.
Okay, it's about a guy, his wife, and then can't really exactly explain the movie, so
If he's paying any attention at all, he would know way more than, well, it's a movie about this. He would know some important points of the plot, and he didn't know any of those things.
When detectives confront him about lying, Brian tries to offer up something else.
Brian, we got some problems. This is the time in the interview where you really need to cowboy up. We've done our homework, and I'm here to tell you, you didn't go to the movie.
we went through cars. And that's gonna slot.
Brian insists that he lied because he didn't want to get into trouble with the law.
He says that approximately 10 p.m. they had started opening doors and checking cars until they finally went over to Tori's house at midnight, and that is when they were locked down there for the evening.
But then, Brian changes his story yet again.
It's pretty obvious that Brian Draper's been crying. He's just very emotional, and he wants to tell the truth now.
Brian tells us that Tori had committed this crime and that Tori told him that if he didn't help, that he was going to kill him. When they did leave the house, what they did is they went to their car. They then entered the residence through a door that they had left unlocked in the basement. And at that point in time, Cassie and Scott were still upstairs. And in an attempt to lure both Cassie and Scott downstairs, Tori started turning the lights off and on, throwing a few items. And what they were trying to do was get both of these two young individuals to come downstairs where they'd be ambushed. Scott gets a call from his mother that both Brian and Tori can hear. So what do? They turn the lights back on at the house so nothing's out of the ordinary, and they just lie in wait downstairs until Scott leaves with his parents. Him and Tori then walk up the stairs. Cassie's there, and she screams. Tori then rushes her and starts stabbing her.
By the time that we realized what actually was happening with Tori, they had both ran out of the home.
Brian's explanation of what happened is quite a believable explanation. He's a young person who's just seen something horrific happen. He wasn't a party to the offense, as he's described to the police. police, and for the police, it would have been a very plausible explanation that he was completely unaware that Tori was going to commit the murder.
Later on, both of the boys appeared at Tori's house. Tori went in and told his parents, "Hey, I'm home. Sorry I'm late." He was supposed to be home at 11. That helps give him an alibi. Then he and Brian go hang out in the house until about 1:30 when they leave. They bring alcohol and the shovel and stuff with them, and they buy matches. They had driven out to a place called Black Rock Canyon, which is south of Pocatello. They had buried all of their things, their knives, everything in this hole, poured the alcohol in it and lit it on fire. They left shortly thereafter, about 2:30 or so, and went back to Tori's house.
What we have with Brian's story is something called the Svengali defense, whereby when you have a co-conspirator or a partner in crime who maybe signed on for one thing, and when things then get out of control, is too afraid to act because they're afraid they may be the next victim. They're essentially brainwashed and just go along with it. This is a way to try to diminish criminal responsibility.
With Brian's confession, Cassie's boyfriend Scott is finally eliminated as a suspect in her murder. Investigators now confront Tori about his involvement in Cassie's murder.
When we get Tori in and ask him, "Did you kill somebody?" Tori says, "I want a lawyer."
We've talked to a lot of people, we've seen a lot of things, we've put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Can I talk to an attorney?
You can do that.
So we cease our interview of Tori at this point in time.
Detectives need Brian's cooperation to build their case and convince him to take them to the spot where the boys burned and buried the evidence.
The fire had not burned everything. Alcohol is not the best accelerant. Had they grabbed a can of gas or something, important pieces of evidence that this was done in haste. Pulling items out of this fire pit, we find a scream mask, some outer covering clothing, and their knives that they had used.
Most importantly, we find something that Brian didn't tell us had been there. We find a videotape. Videotape turned out to be the most damning piece of evidence that I've dealt with in my career as a prosecuting attorney.
Hey, hello, Cassie. Say hi, please.
In the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard, investigators have found a video that could be the key to cracking the case wide open.
Yeah, if you're watching this, we're probably deceased.
I'll never forget the moment that I watched the tape for the first time. It was just one of those moments that you're holding your breath, fearful for what you might just see on this videotape.
I'm sorry, Cassie's family, but she's perfect. She's gonna die.
It shows Tori and Brian plotting, and they describe themselves as evil.
We found our victim, and she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddard, and she's going to be alone in a big, dark house. How perfect can you get?
When we think about what is the psychology that's driving Tori and Brian's behavior,
There should be no law against killing people.
when you have people who have callous and unemotional traits, they don't have the same level of empathy for other people, that has been led to what we call fledgling psychopathy.
I'm horny just thinking about it. Hell yeah.
They wanted to become famous. They wanted to be serial killers.
We're sick psychopaths who get pleasure of killing other people. That sounds good, baby. We're gonna go down in history. We're gonna be just like Scream, except real life terms. We're gonna be murderers. Baby. Like, let's see, Ted Bundy, like the Hillside Strangler, the Zodiac Killer. Those people are more amateurs compared to what we're gonna be.
I have no doubt that if they would have gotten away with Cassie's murder, that they would have killed again.
One consistent theme keeps recurring. They have a fascination for movies where people are killed, slaughtered, if you will, indiscriminately, largely with knives. And so we took from Tori Adamchik's house a collection of knives and a very large collection of horror movies. Brian Draper's house, we seized a bunch of movies as well.
The fact that these two boys have a shared obsession and that their worlds intersected, this is essentially a nuclear reaction. This is what makes these pairings.
Just talk talked to them. We were there for an hour. But we checked out the whole house. We know there's lots of places to hide. We're ready.
I think one of the things that becomes apparent is Tori and Brian wanted to create their own horror movie, and they wanted to have that kind of everlasting fame and terror associated with their names. Their motivation was based a lot on trying to live in a world where they inspired fear and power and control over other people.
Investigators can now piece together Cassie's final 24 hours.
On September 22nd, 2006, Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper arrived together in Tori Adamczyk's car about 8:20 p.m. at Cassie's aunt's house.
Brian and Tori took a tour of the house to scope it out for this crime. They left a door unlocked so they could sneak back in later so they could carry out their plan.
Tori and Brian leave Cassie and Scott saying that they're going to watch a movie at a movie theater. They use that as their ruse to leave the house at 9:45 p.m. Sometime just after 10, they re-entered the house through the door that Tori had left unlocked. This time, though, they're in their masks and in their costumes. They have their knives with them.
At approximately 10:15 p.m., they started turning the lights off and on. Pretty soon, the power comes back on, and Scott makes a determination that he's going to call his mother.
So at 11:20 p.m., Scott leaves the house with his parents. And at that point, Brian and Tori put the rest of their plan into action. They go up the stairs and then attack Cassie in the living room.
Brian and Tori filmed themselves at approximately 11:31 p.m., just after they had killed Cassie. So we know in that rough 10-minute time, that's the time that it took them to kill Cassie.
I think fantasy is actually what may have brought these two youth together. And they're feeding off one another. And when we think about all the stated motivations here, potentially to make a slasher movie, to potentially be serial killers, they all have the same underlying theme. I want people to listen to me. I want people to see me. And I think at some level, that's what each of these boys wanted.
Both Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper are charged with first-degree murder. They are convicted and sentenced to life without parole.
As a prosecuting attorney, there are certain cases that you'll never forget. This is one of those cases that will have a lasting effect on me for the rest of my life. I know as a father, I can tell you I hugged my...
All these years, the thing that sticks out to me most in this case is that there were a lot more victims than just Cassie and her family. Our community was a victim. I think all of us that worked on it left a lot of ourselves here. Certainly, all of us lost a lot of our innocence that day. And I know Cassie's family has had trouble. I mean that in the sense of grief and loss. They never got to see her graduate, walk down the aisle. You know, so many things they didn't get. So, these cases affect all of us. They absolutely do. So.
He had literally just walked in the door and was shot right where he stood. She had received her gunshot wound to the back of her head.
Dennis and Myrna were a family-oriented, classic grandparents and parents.
Because of their death, there's going to be a large payout. Their beneficiaries are their children.
She may act in a vengeful manner to try and take what she feels is rightfully hers.
He had pulled a gun on a female. He stated that the only way she was going to leave was in a body bag.
The neighbor tells the sheriff that he thinks they were murdered by a professional hitman sent for him.
Not mentioning the $50,000 check, did Vegas? They ask, what else is he lying about?
It's our opening. We have gotten that golden nugget.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. La Crosse, Wisconsin, a jewel of the Midwest, located along the Mississippi River.
La Crosse County is located on the western side of Wisconsin. It's got the water. We've got a lot of bluffs, which makes the area very beautiful. One of the little-known mottos of the county is where rivers flow, bluffs rise, and the beer is always cold.
Berry Mills is a small community on the outskirts of La Crosse. It is a very affluent neighborhood. Everybody knew each other.
Crime is very low. It's very safe. Homicides are so rare for us. The sheriff's office investigated only one homicide that year.
On a quiet Monday morning in May, 911 receives an alarming call.
What's going on? My dad's on the floor. Where's your mom? My mom is with a computer. Is your mom breathing? No. Okay, and your dad is not breathing? I touched my dad's leg, and he was moving. My mom's arm is purple. Can you just step out of the house until I get an officer there?
The first arriving deputy observes a white male outside of the residence. He identifies himself as Eric Cola, and Eric is visibly distraught, and he points to the residence for the officer, describing that his mother and father are inside, apparently deceased.
It was violence, and that was likely the cause of their death.
The deputy observes Dennis Cola lying on the kitchen floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. The deputy finds Myrna Cola slumped over a computer with blood dripping from her head onto her body and onto the floor. The medical examiner determined that it was a homicide.
The victims are Dennis and Myrna Cola, a loving couple who have been happily married for 42 years.
They were in their late 60s. They were still very active. They were family-oriented and the classic grandparents and parents. They have 2 adult children, and they were very important in Dennis and Myrna's life, just like an idyllic family.
Dennis Cola went to school to become a pharmacist, was very successful. He was able to open up several pharmacies. Eventually, he decided to open up his own car dealership, which was also successful. Myrna Cola, she was a teacher at heart and enjoyed her teaching career. They were hard-working individuals. They were the typical Midwestern that whatever they had, they earned.
Heading up the investigation into the double murder of Dennis and Myrna Cola is Sheriff Steve Helgeson of the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department. Assisting him is Special Agent John Christopherson.
A double homicide in our county, that's very rare. When we have a case that seems complicated, that's when we involve the Department of Justice. Special Agent Christopherson, he's an excellent investigator.
As I entered the residence, I observed Dennis Cola lying face down and his jacket still on. Large pool of blood around the upper half of his body. Grasped in his hands were his water bottle and his car keys, indicating that he had literally just walked in the door from work and was shot right where he stood as he entered the doorway. To the right is the computer room, and I observe Myrna Cola slumped over the computer, her left hand on the computer board. And you can tell that she was comfortable where she was at the time that she was shot, as if she had sat down to start working on the computer.
As detectives take a closer look at the bodies, they notice an important detail.
They had started to deteriorate or decompose. As a result, there was the imminent smell of, for lack of better terms, death in the air. So we knew that this was before the bodies were discovered.
Investigators continue to comb through the crime scene, searching for evidence.
All of the dressers that were noted had all of their drawers open, but there were several valuables that were still in the dresser drawers and other areas of the residence that were untouched. It appeared to be that the scene was staged for a mock robbery. There was no sign of any struggle. There did not appear to be any type of forced entry into the residence. Inside a walk-in closet was a .22 caliber bolt-action rifle, single shot. On a shelf above the rifle was stored some .22 caliber rounds of ammunition. You could tell that it had been sitting for a while in one particular spot because there was an indent in the carpeting, but the rifle was just sitting to the left of the indentation, indicating that the rifle had been moved. This potentially could have been a weapon used to shoot Dennis and Myrna. So we sent that down to the crime laboratory to have ballistics take a look at it. Additionally, we took Dennis and Myrna Cola's cell phones and computers to be analyzed. We believe that the individual that was responsible for this had to have been known by Dennis and Myrna or did a very good job of hiding themselves at the time of the homicide. And if it was somebody that was in hiding, it had to have been an ambush or an assassination type of incident.
To catch Dennis and Myrna Cola's killer, investigators need to piece together their final 24 hours.
We've got two affluent individuals who have gunshot wounds to their head. We've got an affluent neighborhood which has very limited crime. We're wondering who would have a grudge deep enough to go after Dennis and Myrna, and if it's not a grudge, is there someone who would benefit as a result of their deaths? We have a lot of unanswered questions, especially with a couple that seems to be loved by everybody.
Investigators turn their focus to establishing the victims' timelines in the hours leading up to their death.
Eric Cola is standing outside of the residence. He's very distraught. He's hysterical. He's crying. His wife, Christine, joins him at the scene. Eric tells us that both of his parents were supposed to work on that Monday, May 24th. Eric received a phone call at 8:15 a.m. from the school district where Myrna was teaching, stating that she had not shown up for work. At 8:21 a.m., he telephones his mother and gets her voicemail and leaves a message. He'd like them not to answer their phone, so Eric was worried. He got in his vehicle and drove out to his parents' house to check on them to see what possibly could be wrong. At 8:45 a.m., Eric arrived. He entered the residence. He discovered his father lying face down. Then he found his mother slumped over the computer. He called 911. He was asked if there were individuals that had access to his parents' residence. Eric stated that the Colas often left their doors unlocked during the daytime in case friends wanted to come and visit.
Investigators ask Eric and Christine about the last time they saw or spoke to Dennis and Myrna.
Eric stated the last time that he had seen his parents was on Thursday, May 20th. He had stopped to talk to his dad and help him put some boards on the deck of their residence. After that, Eric had reached out over the weekend to ask his parents over for a cookout and left a voicemail message for them, but did not receive a response. Eric said he knew that they had social plans, so he believed at that time that they were tied up with friends.
As investigators begin to search for a suspect, they get an unexpected lead.
I received a call from Steve Burgess, who is the president of a local bank, who lived across the street from the Colas. He told me that possibly the homicides were intended for him and his family rather than Dennis and Myrna.
The neighbor tells the sheriff that he thinks they were murdered by a hitman sent for him. The sheriff says that if there's even a modicum of truth to this story, that we're talking about a professional hit in a small town, case of mistaken identity, the investigation just got a lot more complicated.
Prominent La Crosse residents, Dennis and Myrna Cola, have been brutally murdered. Their neighbor, local banker Steve Burgess, has given investigators a surprising new lead.
He actually called me and he said that he had received a threat by phone just 2 days earlier. Being the president of the bank, there was a number of distasteful things he had to do because of the economy at that time was failing, and there was a number of loans that people weren't able to satisfy.
If we rewind the clock to 2008, this is among the worst financial crises and housing market meltdowns in history. There was a lot of desperate people, a lot of angry people who had lost everything, and to be involved in financial services at that time, that would have been very dangerous in some cases. A lot of them had targets on their back.
The caller had told Steve Burgess that his days were numbered, so Steve was very concerned with these threatening phone calls, especially because when you Google his address, sometimes the Google Maps actually points to the Kula residence rather than his residence. The thought came, did somebody that was not familiar with the area come out to do harm to the Burgesses and got the wrong house?
Investigators start to work the theory that a hitman could be behind the Kola murders in a case of mistaken identity.
So we needed to establish who he was getting those threatening phone calls from and a timeline as to when those phone calls were received.
Before investigators get the chance to identify the person making threatening calls to Steve Burgess, their forensic computer expert makes a significant discovery.
When we looked at Myrna's body position, her left hand was on the computer. As a result of computer analysis, we could determine the time that she was on the computer. She had started using the computer at 5:14 p.m. and her last keystroke was at 5:41 p.m. It is very rare in a death investigation that we can find the exact time of death unless we have an eyewitness that actually observed it. This helped us do a timeline with an exact time and date. We were able to confirm Dennis and Myrna Kola had died on a Friday evening and were not found until Monday morning. It appeared that Myrna was the one who had been murdered first. As far as the time of death for Dennis, we know that on Friday, May 21st, he worked from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It generally takes him approximately 1 hour to drive home. So if he arrived home at 6 o'clock p.m., it would have been 6 o'clock p.m. or very shortly thereafter that he had been shot as he made entry into his own home. This timeline on the Friday evening helped to eliminate the potential of the individual threatening Steve Burgess because his last threatening phone call was received over the weekend after the Kolas had been killed.
With the hitman theory ruled out, investigators turn to the medical examiner in search of new leads.
The autopsy confirmed that Dennis and Myrna were both killed as a result of a gunshot wound. A bullet that was retrieved from Dennis Kola's head was consistent with a .22 caliber rifle, which was found in the closet of the Kola residence. The .22 caliber rifle was also dusted for fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, but no discernible evidence was able to be retrieved as that weapon. It was very frustrating from an investigative standpoint.
It's one more small piece of that puzzle, but we needed to really find more evidence.
Looking for a motive, investigators dig into the Kola's background.
Dennis and Myrna Kola had substantial investments, and they had large life insurance policies. Because of their death, there's going to be a large payout. Their beneficiaries are their children, Eric and Cindy.
With this new information, investigators take a closer look at the Kola's children. They first question their son, Eric.
Eric stated that he was very close to his parents, especially to his dad. He and his dad would golf together, they would do projects together. He also felt very close to his mom. He would go over on a regular basis to help his mom. So Eric had a very strong relationship with his family.
Investigators ask Eric about his whereabouts during the time frame of the murders.
So on Friday, May 21st, he got up in the morning and then at 8:30 a.m. he began day trading.
Eric stated that he was very successful. He was pocketing between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. At 4 in the afternoon, Eric left the house to go help his friend Mike grout a shower.
Eric said that he left Mike's about 5:15 p.m. and on his way home stopped at the Bridgeview Plaza Garden Center in order to purchase a hanging plant to give his wife as an anniversary present. He arrived at about 5:30 p.m., but didn't see anything he liked, so he went to a different store. He was able to find a plant that he liked and headed home to get ready for their anniversary dinner that night. Around 7:30, he and his wife left to go to the restaurant.
As we look at the timeline that Eric had provided us, it's very tight. His friend Mike confirms that Eric had been at Mike's residence.
Eric also was able to produce a receipt that indicated he had purchased a plant at 6:15 p.m.
We believe that there's no way that Eric could have an involvement in his parents' death because he would not have had time to commit the homicides.
With Eric eliminated as a suspect, investigators ask if there's anyone he could think of who may want to harm his parents.
He felt we needed to look at his sister and brother-in-law. He felt that they should be considered to be suspects. He talked about money that was owed by his sister to his parents.
Cindy's a 38-year-old female who is the youngest of the children of Dennis and Myrna. Her income was very limited. Patrick was kind of a job hopper, and he had recently lost his position. He and Cindy were struggling to make ends meet.
In addition to Cindy and Patrick Cowell's financial struggles, Eric reveals a disturbing detail about their relationship history.
According to Eric, Patrick had a violent history that included pulling a gun on Cindy at one time because Cindy threatened to leave him, and Patrick stated that the only way she was going to leave was in a body bag. They stayed together, but with the financial strain, the violent history, this was a potential lead in the deaths of Dennis and Myrna Cole.
After learning about Cindy Cowell's financial struggles, coupled with the fact that she will inherit almost $800,000 from her parents' death, investigators bring her down to the station for questioning.
Cindy held a job at a collection agency for minimal wages. Patrick was unemployed, and they struggled financially.
Detectives ask Cindy about the last time she communicated with her parents.
Cindy last had contact with her father, Dennis, on Friday morning, May 21st. Shortly before 9 o'clock, she discussed with her father her financial problems, and Dennis was frustrated by that.
They were apparently low on funds. Patrick's unemployment check had not yet arrived. Dennis had made some negative comments about his son-in-law, indicating her husband was not doing a good job taking care of her and her daughter. Cindy indicated to us that she felt that Eric was her parents' favorite child. Eric was receiving a lot more money than she was.
Eric received several $100,000 to help him with his day trading career. Cindy, on the other hand, although she was given money to assist with her financial problems, she is receiving less than $10,000 in assistance.
She was somewhat bitter over the fact that she wasn't being taken care of as well, financially at least, as Eric was.
That's a hard place to be, especially if there's a golden boy or a brother who is getting a lot from your parents. You may feel that you're not accepted into the family. That may cultivate feelings of envy, and she may act in a revengeful manner to try and take what she feels is maybe rightfully hers.
Investigators ask Cindy about her whereabouts on May 21st. The day of her parents' murders.
Cindy went to work in the morning, ultimately left work at 4:45 in the afternoon, then went to a grocery store. She arrived home somewhere between 5:30 and 6 o'clock p.m., where she stayed the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. We went to the grocery store. We were able to determine she did go to that grocery store at that time, and from there, she went home. Had she, in fact, left the grocery store and gone to the Cola's residence, she would have arrived later than the timestamp on the computer for Myrna to have been killed. So we know that in the time frame she provided, Cindy was not a suspect in these homicides.
With financial gain still a potential motive, investigators turn their attention to Cindy's husband, Patrick Cowell.
Cindy stated that there was no way, despite the fact that there was stress between Patrick and her parents, that no way he would ever do something such as murdering them. but we still needed to follow up with her husband, Patrick. He's unemployed, he's at home all day long, and certainly has opportunity throughout the day to come up with a possibility of being the individual responsible for these deaths.
When investigators dig into Patrick's background, they uncover more red flags.
He had a history of infidelity, alcoholism. At one point we learned that he had pulled a gun on a female. We talked to family and friends about what Dennis and Myrna thought and expressed regarding family members. We learned that Dennis was not pleased at all with Patrick and in fact referred to him as a lazy bum, and that Myrna was completely explicit with her dislike to Patrick, including the fact that if Cindy remained married to Patrick, she may not get her inheritance at the time of Dennis and Myrna Cola's death.
With Patrick in their crosshairs, investigators bring him down to the station for questioning.
He was very forthcoming about his relationship with Cindy, and he said although there are struggles in the dynamics, he's comfortable with the life that he is having with Cindy.
Detectives then question Patrick about his relationship with his in-laws.
Patrick told us he does get along with his in-laws okay, but in talking to other individuals close to the Colas, it's a complete contrast. They paint a picture that Patrick is not well liked, so we have to consider who is telling the truth. What type of relationship really did occur between them?
Investigators uncover another red flag when they ask Patrick about his work history.
He told us that he was a 4-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps, thus indicating to us that he had experience with weapons.
We're trying to figure out motive, but we also have to figure out who is capable of doing this. The fact that Patrick was in the Marine Corps was of interest. Someone that was unexperienced with firearms probably wouldn't be able to.
Detectives then ask Patrick about his timeline on the day of the Colas murders.
He explains to us that he gets up between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. He assists his daughter in getting ready for school and out the door. And then from that time until 6 o'clock p.m., he watches TV and plays on his Xbox video games. So we have an individual who claims he's been at home all day playing video games. He has experience in shooting firearms. And he's got motive. He and Cindy are financially strapped. Is Patrick an individual who is actually capable of committing this crime? We need to dig a little further.
Patrick consents to a search of his home.
His Xbox was sent down to our crime laboratory where forensic analysts were able to determine that the Xbox had been used from the early morning hours on Friday, May 21st until approximately 6 o'clock p.m. After the analysis was complete, we feel that he did not have the time to commit these homicides.
With no new leads, the investigation into the murders of Dennis and Myrna Cola grinds to a halt.
The community was very concerned about the homicide and that nobody had been arrested, and the community was speculating that nobody would be.
Frustration is setting in that we have potential suspects and the door is shutting as we go along. So now we have to sit down, put together a better timeline, look at what we have in place. We need a lead in the deaths of Dennis and Myrna Cola. We need to find that golden nugget.
In the double homicide of grandparents, Dennis and Myrna Cola, investigators believe the killer must be someone within their inner circle. But then a disturbing new clue emerges and shifts the entire direction of the investigation.
We received a call from Eric's wife, Christine. They had information, and we had a deputy to respond to the residence.
Eric explained that he went out to the mailbox where he retrieved a plain white envelope, and inside the envelope was a letter that specifically stated, "Fixed you."
Eric had no explanation for why someone would say "fixed you." He had no one that he had any problems with.
He was visibly upset, and he had no idea where it came from, who it came from, or why it came, but he imagined that whoever had killed his parents could possibly now be looking at him or his family as a target.
We needed to put as much effort as we possibly could into getting to the bottom of that. And Myrna are now leaving Eric a letter that changes things completely as far as motive and what they're willing to do next.
As investigators review the body cam footage from the responding deputy officer, they make a surprising discovery.
Eric's reaction seemed not genuine. It looked like an individual that was faking a heart attack. It looked absolutely staged.
It just was concerning the way he was acting. It didn't make sense to us.
Investigators decide to take a closer look at Eric Cola, starting with his day trading business. To their surprise, it appears Eric is not doing as well financially as he has led them to believe.
During our initial conversations with Eric, he was boastful about the fact that he was making $7,000 to $10,000 a month online trading. We now look into his finances, and he is not only broke, he's dead-ass broke. He's got no money. Where he initially started investing as a day trader, he initially did very well. He had well over $700,000 in assets, and through poor choices and being very egotistical, for a lack of better terms, he now had less than $1,000 of money that he was playing with. He owed tens of thousands of dollars to the IRS. He owed money on his cars. He owed money on credit cards, on his house. He had also taken money from a retirement account and started online trading with that. Then he lost it all. He was in sorrowful shape.
Investigators also uncover evidence of a potentially fraudulent bank transaction in Eric's account.
We learned that on Saturday, May 22nd, Eric deposited a check in the amount of $50,000. The check was signed by his father and dated May 21st, the date that Dennis was murdered. Dennis was at work all day on the 21st, and then when he got home, was shot. Eric never mentioned getting a check from his father.
It was a big deal, and it did beg us to ask what else is he lying about.
To see if Eric visited his father at work to receive the check on the day of his murder, investigators interview his colleagues at the pharmacy.
One of the individuals that we interviewed was the pharmacy tech that Dennis worked with. She told us that a few days prior to his homicide, Dennis point blank stated that he was through financing his children. He was tired of paying their bills, and he was going to cut them off financially. Along with the financial history that we're finding in Eric is explosive. We are feeling we are now finally on the right track. We're looking at a son who has been financially dependent on his parents for years. He is in debt beyond belief. He has the portrayal in front of his friends that he is this exemplary financial genius, and he leads the life of glory. He belongs to the country club. He's driving nice cars. His kids are getting what they want. And now he's told by his dad that he's going to be cut off. How is he going to save face? How is he going to explain to all these people the lies that he has been leading for several months, if not years? Now, keeping in mind that he's in line to inherit hundreds of thousands of dollars, is that enough for a motive? I believe so. So Eric has now moved to the top of the list as our number one suspect in the murder of his parents.
In the chilling double homicide of Dennis and Myrna Cola, investigators are zeroing in on their suspected killer, their own son, Eric Cola.
So we have motive right now for Eric to commit these homicides. However, we've got one glitch, and that's his timeline. His timeline is very tight on Friday evening when his mom and dad are killed. And how do we break that? If it's able to be broken, number one, and if it's not able to be broken, is he really our suspect? We need to dissect that timeline to see if we missed anything.
So Eric said that on May 21st, he left Mike's about 5:15 p.m.
We now go to the second garden center, where he purchased the plant for his wife. We acknowledge that that receipt did come from that location, which shows the timestamp of 6:15 p.m. But we've got this time frame from when he leaves Mike's house to when he buys that plant. During that time frame, did he go to that first garden center? We are able to pull out surveillance video from that first garden center, and we start looking at that tape from 5:15 p.m. to almost 7 o'clock p.m. We sat for hours, and Eric or his vehicle never show up on that video. It's our timeline opening. We have gotten that golden nugget.
Our investigators then checked to see, is it possible that he left Mike's and could have made it to the Kula residence, committed the crime, and then got back to purchase the plant at the other store? It was possible.
Having broken his alibi, investigators start building their case against Eric Kola.
We've got a $50,000 check that he deposited into his account Saturday, May 22nd, after the Kolas had been killed. We take that check and bring it down to our analysts at the crime laboratory. Through analysis and handwriting exemplars, we learn that Eric is the one that signed that check for $50,000 and not Dennis Kola.
With Eric now the prime suspect in his parents' murders, investigators bring him in for another interview.
I need to get as much information from him as I can. Even if it's not a confession, a provable lie is as good as a confession. Or I just need something to link him to those homicides. When Eric is confronted with the fact that we cannot find him on the surveillance video at all, from 5:15 p.m. to almost 7 o'clock, he does not change his story. He is adamant that he went to that location and he just must be missed, and he's sticking with that story.
Then, Eric makes a surprising revelation.
For the very first time, without me saying anything, he lets me know that he received a $50,000 check from his father. I talked to him about the fact that the signature on the check was not his father's, and he let me know that he was in fact the one that signed his father's name, that he had done that numerous times in the past, that his dad just gave him a blank check, and that it was not out of the ordinary for him to be able to do that. I did not believe him. I watched his body language, I listened to the tone of his voice, and all of the indicators were there of an individual who was being very deceptive.
Investigators confront Eric about his involvement in his parents' murders.
He was adamant that he was not involved in injuring his parents or hurting his parents. He couldn't make eye contact with me, but what was real enlightening to me is that Eric never said, "I didn't kill my parents."
As Christofferson continues interrogating Eric Kola, a team of investigators search his house.
During the course of the search warrant at his residence, 2 envelopes are located, each of them containing the same blemish as the envelope that contained the "Fixed You" letter. We now know without question, Eric is the one that put that letter in his own mailbox.
I think Eric wrote this note because that's typically what he does to get himself out of trouble. He forges, he is a fraudster, he resorts to what he knows to try to
Raveling in the interview room.
The individual that I met originally at his parents' home when they were discovered deceased is a changed individual. I'm looking at an individual who is deceptive, scared, an individual who is on the run on the inside. Eric Kola is the individual who killed his parents, and there's no doubt in my mind he's the one.
Investigators are now able to reconstruct Myrna and Dennis Kola's final 24 hours.
On May 20th, Eric went to see his parents, and we surmised that his parents told him no more money and that they were no longer going to support him in any way financially.
In his desperation, Eric concludes that the only way to get out of this financial debt is to kill his parents and obtain the inheritance totaling $800,000. On Friday, May 21st, Eric leaves his friend Mike's house at 5:15 p.m. He drives to his parents' house, arriving there at approximately 5:30 p.m., where he's greeted by his mother, Myrna, who is working on the computer in the computer room. It is believed at this time that Eric goes to an upstairs bedroom and retrieves his father's .22 caliber bolt-action rifle.
At 5:41 p.m., Eric shot his mother from behind with the .22 rifle.
Myrna slumps over the computer, her left hand on the keyboard. After shooting his mother, Eric waits in the residence for his father. At approximately 6 o'clock p.m., as Dennis Kola enters the kitchen, Eric shoots Dennis in the right side of the head, dropping Dennis to the floor.
Eric then left the house and purchased a plant with a receipt so that he would have an alibi as to where he was.
Detectives charge Eric Kola with the murder of his parents.
These are hard cases for us to understand. Who wants to kill their own parents? It's almost like a psychological iceberg where you see the financial needs at the top, but underneath all of that, there's feelings of entitlement or some fragile narcissism here that's at the root of this crime.
In August 2012, Eric stands trial and is found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. He's sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole.
The ultimate piece of evidence that helped us put the case together is the timeline of events and the break in time that Eric had to commit this crime.
That kind of violence could take place.
There's a certain Shakespearean tragic undercurrent to this case, whereby, again, no good deed goes unpunished. We have 2 parents who doted on their child for 41 years, and ultimately, it was never enough. And when they finally tried to set him on his own way in the world, he reacted in the most brutal way you could imagine.
There's no question in my mind the jury rendered the correct verdict. I felt sad for Eric's family, for Cindy's family, and for the grandchildren. And so it was bittersweet. But I was happy that we were able to get a conclusion in this horrific crime.
She is the quintessential soccer mom. This is a woman who has left 3 children at home with a nanny and has been gone for 2 full days.
We are realizing that this is not just a missing person, but actually potentially a homicide.
People don't get divorced because they love each other.
The children had said that he was going to kill her.
This was a bombshell. To learn that a soccer mom had this secret life.
He's the only person that possibly was in that area both days and both times.
I don't care what business you're in, nobody deserves to have this happen to them.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Grand Junction, Colorado, a scenic and rugged outdoor paradise.
Grand Junction is a beautiful place. It's in the Grand Valley, surrounded by picturesque views. You can do everything here. You can ski, you can bike, you can fish, you can hike. It's typically very quiet, and it's just usually a very safe place.
Grand Junction is a small community. The city itself is about 50,000 people. The county is about 185,000.
We have violent crime. Percentage-wise, it may not be as high of violent crime rate as big cities by any means. That doesn't mean we don't have our share.
And with a vast wilderness to explore, a person can easily disappear.
The case starts when Mr. Howard Bigler calls the Mesa County Sheriff's Office on a Saturday morning, June 30th, and says, his ex-wife, who he has recently got back into a relationship with. He hadn't heard from her. He had seen her on the 28th of June in person for a picnic and had not been able to get a hold of her since that time. This is a woman who has left 3 children at home with a nanny and has been gone for 2 full days. They're reporting that this is not normal behavior for her, that she often checks in with both Mr.
Woman is Paige Bergfeld, a 34-year-old loving mother and entrepreneur.
Paige was divorced twice, but a very devoted mother of 3 children. She was involved in 3 different businesses. She was highly respected and enjoyed by a lot of the people that she dealt with.
She seemed, by all accounts, to be the quintessential soccer mom. She is caring. She is always there for her kids, very present. And she has a lot of friends and a lot of family that loves her.
Mesa County detectives Lisa Norcross and Wayne Weiler are tasked with looking into Paige Bergfeld's disappearance.
If you have a person who's missing under highly unusual circumstances, the quicker you can get information, the better chances you are at solving the case.
The first thing we want to do is obtain a timeline and try to determine when the last time she was seen, where did she go, who did she spend time with.
Detectives begin by requesting Paige's cell phone records from June 28th until June 30th.
Howard Biegler told us he last spoke with Paige at around 9 o'clock on the 28th of June. Her phone records showed, indeed, the last phone call we know she made was around 9 o'clock to Mr. Biegler, and that phone call was here in the Grand Junction area. This is the last time anyone talked with her. We have records for shortly thereafter, and she does not make any other future phone calls, ever. So we as investigators have to start wondering if maybe she had met up with someone and foul play had occurred and something had happened to her.
Then, at 10 p.m. on July 1st, 3 days after Paige's last known whereabouts, police and fire departments are dispatched to a vehicle fire.
We get a call that there's a car on fire at a local manufacturing plant, Walker SMS, and that the car is fully engulfed. The fire department was able to extinguish the fire. Not everything inside the interior burned.
The license plates were not on the vehicle, which was a little bit suspicious. In addition, there was the smell of an accelerant.
The VIN number, we checked that, and it's found to be Paige's car. The car that she had driven to Eagle to meet up with Mr. Bergfeld.
At this point, we're absolutely sure that there's foul.
Detectives meticulously search the car for any remaining evidence.
In the trunk, there is a day planner there. Interestingly, there are 4 pages missing from the day planner, which was not burned, and those pages are the 26th through the 29th of June. We're obviously very interested in the fact that those 4 days specifically are missing, because one of those days is the day that Ms. Bergfeld is reportedly last known to be alive. We also find that the driver's seat is pushed all the way back to suit someone much taller than Paige Bergfeld, who is 5'4". She didn't drive it, so that tells us somebody much taller may have. When you have a missing person under really suspicious circumstances, and you have their car found on fire, and you still don't know where they are, and you're talking about a mom of 3 small children, that's not normal.
And that was really the first time that we are realizing that this is not just a missing person, but actually potentially a homicide.
Having established that Paige was likely murdered, detectives need to piece together her final 24 hours in order to find her killer.
The first people we look at are people that are closest to the victim. Mr. Biegler, right away, obviously just by the fact that he was an ex-husband, had was the last person that spent time with him. Obviously, he is a person that we would look at.
Howard Beegler explains to investigators that he has known Paige for years. They were high school sweethearts. They got married. They had a short marriage for a couple years. He's telling us that they're back together and they're in an intimate relationship. So we must delve into that to look to see if there's been any problems there.
Why did he come back into her life at that point? What were the reasons for the relationship ending? What was his relationship with the second husband? Was there any jealousy issues?
Mr. Beegler was asked about their marriage and why they got divorced, and he explained that they got divorced specifically because she met a gentleman named Rob Dixon, and he had more money, and she was interested in that. When it comes to people who either currently are in relationships or have previously been in relationships, high emotions can lead to violence. It can lead to someone killing another human being. We have to look at that as a possibility.
Oftentimes people think, oh, well, he must not have done it, he reported her missing. Well, of course, a lot of times people do that to try and throw law enforcement off the scent.
Murder of soccer mom Paige Bergfeld. Detectives have their sights on Howard Beegler, Paige's ex-husband and current boyfriend.
We need to know where he was during that week, inclusive of June 28th and July 1st. Mr. Beegler reports to us that he and Paige had previously made arrangements to both meet in Eagle, Colorado, which is about halfway in between their homes, about 2 to 2.5 hour drive for each of them. Howard told us that on the 28th of June, he and Paige were together from about 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 7 o'clock in the evening, that they had a picnic date in the park in Eagle, Colorado.
He remembers her leaving about 7 p.m., going westbound on I-70 back to Grand Junction.
Beegler tells investigators that he then gets into his vehicle and drives home towards Denver, making a call to Paige at 8:57 p.m. while driving.
We look into Mr. Beegler's phone to find out where that is.
The proliferation of cell phones next to DNA has probably been the biggest game changer in homicide investigation. They're basically honing devices whereby you can follow an offender or a suspect's movements by the way that their cell phone will ping off towers and essentially plot a trail of their movements.
We were able to track his movements back to the Denver area at the same time she was traveling back to the Grand Junction area after their little rendezvous on Thursday. He had remained in Denver both at the time that she went missing and at the time that the car was set on fire. So we were able to rule him out because of that.
With ex-husband Howard Beegler cleared, investigators push for their next suspect.
Investigators receive a phone call from a gentleman named Stephen Heald. He knows Paige. He has heard that she is missing, and he said he wants to provide information to us. Mr. Heald tells us Paige mentions to him that her ex-husband, Rob Dixon, is coming to town.
Paige had confided in him that she was scared of Rob Dixon. He had concerns that Rob Dixon might have harmed Paige.
Rob Dixon is a natural person we have to question. People don't get divorced because they love each other.
Looking for a motive, investigators dig into Rob and Paige's marriage.
He became Paige's second husband, second love, and all of her kids were with Rob. They were together for a long time. And then as the relationship started to fall apart, he, I believe, moved to Durango first and ultimately moved.
That Rob and Paige ran into a bunch of financial problems, and that broke up their relationship. Frank told us that Rob, at first, was a good guy and seemed to be a nice husband. Near the end of the relationship, he said he wasn't so nice, and it wasn't a good relationship. There were kind of two sides to Rob.
We know money makes the world go round, and money also causes tremendous conflict in these relationships. So left over time, this continued to build into something that really can create a motive for murder.
Detectives discover there's more to Paige and Rob's troubled history than just financial issues.
Close friends of Paige had disclosed to us that the children had overheard threats made by Rob Dixon. Paige had told a friend that the children had said that he was going to kill her. We checked our records, and there had been numerous calls of disturbances between Mr. Dixon and Paige Dixon at that time. Mr. Dixon had been arrested for domestic violence in the past. Paige had been fearful and concerned that her ex-husband was moving back into the area. So obviously, he became high on the list of suspects.
With Paige's ex-husband Rob Dixon in their crosshairs, investigators haul him into the station for questioning.
He denies that they had prior violence between the two. He does discuss that they argued. He also talks about they disagreed on some things with the children.
But when talking about his past with Paige, he seemed to be deceptive. He seemed to be deflective of some of the questions that we asked. It raises suspicions as to why is he not being forthcoming.
Did you threaten to kill her when you had the domestic violence?
No, I did not.
Did you threaten to do any bodily harm whatsoever?
No. I don't know where this is coming from. I don't understand. I don't understand why this is happening.
Detectives want to know where Dixon was between June 28th and July 1st, the window of time they believe Paige was killed.
Rob Dixon provides us an alibi and says that he was in Pennsylvania working as an EMT over several of those days, and says when he wasn't working, he had several friends helping him pack up his home to move down to the Durango, Colorado area to work there. We look at Rob Dixon's alibi, and we find that indeed he was working in Pennsylvania. Long 12-arm firm that he was indeed with friends on the day of the car fire. He could not have come to Colorado in the time in between.
Before investigators let Dixon walk out the door, they ask him if he could think of anyone who might have held any ill will towards Paige.
Paige has at least 2 lives. I mean, there's the Paige that everybody knows, and then there's another Paige.
Rob Dixon tells us he's concerned that Paige may have met foul play by someone involved in the escort business that she was running.
This was a bombshell. To learn that a soccer mom that was so involved in the community had this secret life.
No one could believe it. In terms of Grand Junction, it's pretty scandalous. No one was expecting it. Not from Paige Bergfeld. As investigators were acutely aware that being involved in the escort business puts you at a much higher risk for violence, serious assaults, or even death.
Anytime you're dealing with a secret life that involves illegal activity, you're gonna deal with people who don't want to tell you the truth.
She collected a lot of information about a lot of individuals. The fear of information getting out about their own personal lives is so pronounced that the only way out is to get rid of the individual who's holding this over their head.
There could be so many people who had a motive to kill Paige.
Armed with the revelation that Paige Bergfeld, mother of 3, had been moonlighting as an escort, investigators track down her client list and begin an exhaustive search for suspects.
Paige's number of clients that she had seen just recently blew up the suspect list to about 10 to 15 people, and that became difficult in that we had to include every one of those people.
In hopes of narrowing down their suspect pool, investigators look into who Paige had contact with on June 28th, the day she disappeared.
So we start looking at her phone records, and we see that there's a number that's called multiple times, many times, over the evening of the 27th to the 28th, and we track that number back to a person named George Corluso.
When police look into George Corluso, they discover he's a local house painter.
We try to contact him and don't get any answers on that phone number. But the business partners tell us that George failed to show up for work on June 28th, the same day, routinely and repeatedly throughout the whole day. He tells family and friends there's been a death in the family, and he buys a last-minute plane ticket and leaves Colorado and goes to New Jersey. Cops don't like coincidences, and the timing of his leaving is concerning, very concerning. We're thinking that possibly they met up and things went sour. We don't know that. What we do know is that we need to find George Corluzzo and talk with him as soon as possible.
Investigators travel to New Jersey to interview George Corluzzo.
George tells us that he was looking to get a escort service, a massage service, and that he couldn't find the business, and that he denies he ever met up with anyone. He proceeds to discuss spending the evening getting very, very drunk with friends, and then his girlfriend picked him up at about midnight, and then the next day left Grand Junction to drive over to Denver. He says he parked his car at the Denver airport and flew into New Jersey, which would be prior to the car fire. He does admit that he lied to his business partners about leaving town and that no one was killed in his family, but that he just wants a vacation and doesn't want to tell his business partners, is what he tells us. That's a pretty big lie.
Investigators worked to verify Corluzzo's whereabouts between June 28th, when Paige went missing, and July 1st, when her car was found on fire.
We confirmed the information that George has given us that he was indeed out of town. Investigators find that his car is parked in long-term parking, and they see a parking receipt for where he entered the parking at about 11 o'clock in the evening on June 30th. He flew to New Jersey and arrived there at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which is about 8 or 9 hours before the car fire.
With Corluzzo's alibi checking out, he's eliminated as a suspect. Investigators find themselves at a crossroads.
Everybody in the community knew in their hearts that she had been killed, and our ability to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt was still hampered by that double life that she had and the fact that we hadn't found a body yet.
Paige going missing really woke up Grand Junction to say, wow, we didn't think this could happen in our backyard, but here it is. Something has happened to Paige, and we have to keep working, and we have to keep trying, and we don't give up just because time isn't on our side. It just so happened that somebody driving down Highway 50 in the middle of nowhere had pulled over to check his tires and had noticed, I think it was one of Paige's checks, and started to see that, hey, there's more scattered items out here.
All sorts of items that you would not expect a person to throw out unless they are trying to potentially leave a trail of breadcrumbs.
It was our belief that Paige had been put in the trunk of a vehicle and was trying to leave us a sign of where she was going.
I think everybody thought, this is it. She's leaving us a trail. She's signaling us to her.
After a trail of Paige Bergfeld's belongings are found on the side of a highway, police and volunteers scour the area, hoping to find more evidence and perhaps Paige's body.
Highway 50 is a long stretch. It's extremely rugged and rural. They searched and searched, knowing that they could possibly be looking for a needle in a haystack.
We had a large community search team that went out and found close to 75 pieces of evidence.
But unfortunately, even though all of those personal belongings were found, it didn't lead to her body.
There are murder cases that are prosecuted without a body, but in this particular situation, we're talking about a woman who has a double life. We're talking about a woman who has such a secret life that some of her best friends had no idea that she was doing all of these other things.
Our office continued to look at any possible leads. We had people coming forward with information about the escort business.
When investigators take a closer look into Paige's business, they discover she wasn't working alone.
One of the interesting people that came forward was a woman named Carolyn Linderholm. She was aware of Paige's Models Inc. business, and she had actually participated in some of the calls.
Carol told us that Paige had called her on the 27th of June and asked her to take a client by the name of Jim Jones because Paige had recognized him from a previous visit. She said that Paige was not comfortable because he had recognized her as being Paige Dixon and related to Rob Dixon. She agreed to take the client. She went to Mr. Jones's home on the 27th of June between 10 and 10:30 in the evening. She provided a topless massage. He did ask for additional sexual activity, and she said no.
Investigators learned that Jim Jones is Lester Ralph Jones, a mechanic at Bob Scott RV, which is near Walker SMS Manufacturing.
He works across the street.
His last phone call to anybody was just outside the Walker SMS and just outside Bob Scott RV. We didn't know much about him, and we didn't know much about what his involvement was, but as we started to look into him, there was a lot of very serious coincidences.
Detectives take a second look at Paige's work phone records and discover she received multiple calls from Lester Jones after he met with Carol on June 27th. Armed with this information, they bring Jones into the station for questioning.
Mr. Jones initially denies knowing Ms. Bergfeld and eventually admits that he does know her and admits to having service on June 27th with Carol.
Detectives question Jones about his whereabouts on June 28th, the day Paige disappeared.
Mr. Jones tells us all week, including the 28th of June, that his same routine is right after work. He goes to the Al-Anon Club, socializes with people, drinks coffee for a little bit, then gets some dinner and heads home.
You're not going to find any record if you call them Models Incorporated on Thursday. Mills Round called them. Never called them. Not Thursday night. Thursday. And that's what we clear on Thursday. It's Thursday afternoon, Thursday morning, Thursday night. The last I talked to him was Wednesday night.
Mr. Jones says that no one can corroborate he was home by himself because he was alone. However, he states his wife returned to town on June 30th during the afternoon. While some investigators are talking with Mr. Jones at the sheriff's office, other investigators go out to Mrs. Jones's workplace and contact her. And during that conversation, Ms. Jones said that Mr. Jones was gone Sunday evening on July 1st between about 9 o'clock and 10:15.
He states that he had to drive to Bob Scott's RV and turn off the lights. He puts himself right there at the time of the fire.
When detectives look into Lester Jones's background, they discover a history of domestic abuse and assault.
He has a prior arrest for assault and sexual assault and kidnapping, and that he had been in prison for 3 years. As we dig further into him, we find that with two of his first ex-wives, he had propensity for violence, domestic violence, sexual violence towards both of them.
Having uncovered a pattern of violence against women, detectives put Jones's alibi to the test.
When we confronted Lester about his alibi, he wasn't able to give us any names. We were able to verify that he did in fact go to work that day, but of significance, nobody remembered him being at the club that night on June
8th. And he puts himself in the area on the evening of the car fire. And he's the only person so far that we've run into that possibly was in that area both days and both times.
We were in consultation with the district attorney's office throughout this investigation, and we believed we had the primary suspect in Lester Jones.
Having zeroed in on Lester Jones, police obtained search warrants for his house, vehicles, and place of work.
No-body homicides are rather obviously very difficult investigations and are seldom prosecuted. What you have to do is collect what you call the corpus delicti, or the body of evidence, through other means, and assemble basically a circumstantial case that is rock solid.
As we search his desk in the work area at Bob Scott's, the first thing of note is the gas can that's sitting there. Obviously, with our information that there was accelerants used in the vehicle fire, none of the other employees claim that is their gas can, and they have not seen that there before.
We find lists with names of escort ladies. We find wigs, men's wigs. We find a package of condoms and some Viagra pills. All of this in his closed locker area that is used only by him. We know Mr. Jones and Paige knew each other and she didn't want to see him for that. There's a concern, was he maybe trying to meet up with her and disguise who he was?
We saw that there was a package for a track phone in the trash can next to his desk. It raises our suspicions, and we believe now we're on the right trail.
Criminals or people who are about to commit crime are getting savvy. They understand that their cell phone will be used to track them. A track phone is often used because you don't have to provide your name or your address, so there's no paper trail.
We track that back to being purchased at a specific date and time at a local Walmart store. We go there, we get surveillance video, and lo and behold, it is Lester Jones purchasing that phone.
Investigators obtain records for the prepaid cell phone purchased by Lester Jones.
When we get the phone records, the only calls made using that phone are to Paige Bergfield's Bottles Inc. cell phone. There were 5 calls to and from the phone on the day of her disappearance, and the last call on that phone was at about 7:55 on June 28th, when Paige called Mr. Jones back.
His personal cell phone were unsuccessful. So we assumed that is why he got the prepaid phone, was to disguise who he was and try and convince Paige to meet up with this person she doesn't know.
With the evidence against Lester Jones mounting, investigators obtain another search warrant for 2 computers.
Every evening when he would get home from work, he would get back on his computer, and you were able to see the computer usage.
He was involved with a lot of pornography and checking other escorts and prostitution-type services on June 26th, 27th, while his wife was out of town. On June 28th, during the evening hours, there was no activity, and then again on June 29th and June 30th, there was a lot of activity.
He was a creature of habit, and every day looked exactly the same, except for the day that Paige went missing.
With the search warrants complete, a patrol officer calls Jones's home to arrange for the return of his 2 cars that were seized and searched.
A sergeant in the investigations unit called Mr. Jones and realizes that Mr. Jones sounds almost like he's intoxicated or sounds off-kilter. Mr. Jones says something to the effect of, "You asked me where I would bury a body?" And the sergeant is pretty surprised by that statement because he never asked him that question. Right after that statement was made, Mrs. Jones took the phone and said her husband wasn't feeling well and ended the conversation.
That was a pretty significant fact to us because Mr. Jones actually had a history. He had been convicted of kidnapping his prior wife, and he had actually told her, "I'm going to kill you and bury you in a lake where nobody will ever find your body." And so we knew he was capable of this type of behavior.
But without a body, detectives can't arrest or charge Lester Jones with the crime.
You get one shot at prosecuting on a homicide. So the decision was made to not arrest at the time.
We believe she's dead. We don't know where the body is. We don't know how Lester Jones killed her. We had already decided he was our guy, but it was just not realistic to prosecute him without the body.
In the murder of Paige Bergfeld, detectives have zeroed in on Lester Jones, a former client of the soccer mom turned escort. But without a body or any physical evidence connecting him to the crime, he remains at large.
Finding a body support is not absolute, but it became difficult trying to prosecute without the body because Paige was involved in this.
We were left with waiting and trying to follow up with any other lead that came up.
Obviously, the family was grieved. The community was concerned that there was this killer out there, or alleged killer out there.
It was really hard for Grand Junction. Everybody wanted answers. People that didn't even know her were calling the news station every day saying, "What's the update on Paige? Where is she? Have we found her?"
Months turn into years, and eventually the investigation into Paige Bergfeld's disappearance and presumed murder goes cold.
And then we get a phone call.
On the morning of March 6th, 2012, two hikers stumble onto a key piece of evidence, approximately 45 minutes south of Grand Junction.
Two hikers are down hiking the Wells Gulch area, which is one of our adjacent counties, and they come across some human remains. Investigators from Mesa County and Delta County head down there, do some searching, and find almost a full skeleton of an adult.
We all knew as soon as we heard whose bones they were going to be.
The remains were examined by both the Mesa County coroner and also a forensic anthropologist here in Colorado. There was DNA extracted that was found to match that of Paige Bergfeld. Investigators were glad the remains are finally found. This gives some kind of a small portion of closure to the family, even though this is really hard news to deliver. And that gets us to where we know we're going to be able to close a case.
Having identified the remains as Paige Bergfeld, investigators work to determine a cause of death.
Unfortunately, the forensic anthropologist nor the coroner are able to determine an exact cause of death. There were two fractures on the face, both which would somewhat suggest that there was some kind of a fight. These were determined to be perimortem, which is at about the time of death.
There was duct tape as well as some black tape along her mouth area and around the bones of the body, so it clearly shows that she had been bound either while going into that area or at the area at the time.
With this final piece of the puzzle, detectives are now able to reconstruct Paige's final 24 hours.
Howard Biegler says that they saw each other and he saw her in her car driving towards Grand Junction at about 7 o'clock on June 28th.
At approximately 7:39, we know that Lester Jones from Lester Jones' track phone that he had bought. During this time, we know that she's still driving home. After 8:57 p.m., we know that Paige Bergfeld met up with Lester Jones at either Bob Scott RV or Walker SMS, which is across the street where a vehicle was found.
He kidnapped her and he duct taped around her skull, around her head, which would indicate that she was alive at the point that that happened and likely being driven somewhere. The seat was pushed back in the car, which would indicate that Mr. Jones was driving it.
He drives her to Wells Gulch area out in Delta County. Paige Bergfeld, who's in the trunk of her vehicle, is throwing out cards and checkbooks to lead a trail to where she would be at.
We don't know exactly what the last moments of Paige's life were, but due to information that Mr. Jones had previously threatened other ex-wives and choked them, you can wonder if that's how she met her demise.
Paige was killed at some point and buried deep enough that we didn't find her remains for 5 years. That vehicle was brought back up to Grand Junction and dropped off.
On July 1st, about 9 p.m., Lester Jones realizes that their vehicle is parked across from the street. There could be possible evidence inside that vehicle, so he drives to Bob Scott RV's under the pretense of turning off the lights in his office, goes across the street. He takes 4 pages of the calendar out of the calendar book, uses accelerants, gasoline, or some type of gasoline accelerant, start the fire, and arrives back home where his wife sees him.
He knew that she had information about prior clients in there and needed that evidence gone.
This is by definition a sexual homicide. He has pursued the victim for a sexual purpose.
She was avoiding his phone calls. she was denying him the opportunity to see her. Passing him off to another colleague was probably the last straw for him.
On November 21st, 2014, more than 7 years after Paige Bergfeld's disappearance, Lester Jones is arrested and charged with first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. He is eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Justice was done, justice was due, and justice was delivered.
You have to be in this for the long haul. It took a little over 7 years.
And nobody deserves to have this happen to them.
Despite Lester Jones's sentence, Paige Bergfeld's family is still left reeling from their loss.
When Paige's body was found, I think the stories resurfaced about her double life and her escort service, but I think it was tremendously overshadowed by what a great mom she was. I think at the end of the day, we can all sympathize with somebody that is really just trying to do their best and provide for their family. Did she have other options? We don't know, but she did what she felt she had to do for her family.
It was a horrific scene. She was stabbed 44 times. She was alive for 33 of those stab wounds.
There's some personal connection. This was somebody's rage boiling over.
She was a great big sister. She was the oldest kid on our block. We all kind of lost a mentor.
It really turned this town upside down. The killer was still on the loose.
He was very abusive, a lot of yelling and fights.
He's engaged in stalking younger females.
He was known to carry knives frequently. He looked like a really good suspect.
It's been 24 years. Investigators are really at a standstill here of why and, more importantly, who. The DNA results reveal the name I definitely did not expect to hear again.
This is like discovering a new planet, a suspect who's been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Pleasanton, California is a suburban oasis where families embody the American dream. With well-manicured lawns, white picket fences, and barbecues all summer long.
True to its name, Pleasanton is very pleasant. It's everybody knows everybody kind of place.
Pleasanton in 1984 was just a very small town, only about 30,000 people. Had a really cute main street, still does. There wasn't a lot of crime. It was not uncommon for people to feel that we can leave our doors unlocked, our windows open.
But on a warm afternoon, as students walk home from school, the innocence of Pleasanton would be shattered forever.
On April 5th, 1984, Larry Laval was driving southbound on I-680 about 3:10, 3:15 in the afternoon, and noticed what he thought was a child in distress on the side of the freeway. He pulled his truck to the side of the road, and he noticed the body was covered in blood and was obviously in distress.
So he took the next exit and called 911 from a payphone.
After hearing the call on the creek area, at which time he found the female body, noted that there were a number of stab wounds and clothing soaked with her blood.
She was obviously deceased. She was wearing her school clothes, school books scattered about, papers scattered, the blood-soaked rocks all around her. It was a horrific scene.
Among the responding officers called to the scene is investigator James Knox from the Pleasanton Police Department.
They brought us out And we actually did what they call a grid search, where you go back and forth looking to find the murder weapon, but we're never able to locate what the victim was stabbed with. In processing the crime scene, detectives collected a purse that was found in the tree directly above the body, and within that purse there was a report card which had Tina Fales' name on it, and they were able to make an initial identification based upon that.
Investigators ascertain that the victim is Tina Fales, a freshman at nearby Foothill High School.
Tina Fales was a very sweet girl. She was 14 years old at the time that she was murdered. She came from a really nice family. Her brother Drew was 8 years old at the time.
Great big sister. Took on a mom role quite a bit because my mom was working a lot. Oh, she was definitely more of a wallflower. She'd be a loner at times, but at the same time, I remember her being very mature, just with the way she always looked out for me.
Police traveled to nearby Foothill High School to gather information about Tina and her movements in the hours leading up to her murder.
Tina's last class of the day was geography. After class was let out, she stayed after and talked to the teacher, the geography teacher, for a few minutes. She was supposed to attend detention. She skipped detention. And when she's seen by her classmates, she's last seen heading toward the culvert.
When Tina and I first found the culvert, I remember we were playing in the creek, and we saw kids hanging out there, and they explained to her, oh, this is a shortcut to the high school.
Without that shortcut, Tina would have to go all the way around the freeway, and it would be a much longer journey. So the cut-through really served its purpose. It's a wooded area. There's not a lot of people out there. You can hear the freeway buzzing in the background. It just has kind of a scary feel, an ominous feel. Not somewhere that I would want my kids to use as a cut-through, but very common that the kids used that to get to their neighborhood back in 1984.
Started earlier that day.
That day, during lunchtime, a number of girls had thrown rocks at Tina and threatened to beat her up. It left us wondering if maybe Tina was trying to avoid them and really wanted to get home.
She stopped taking the bus just because that's where she's being bullied on the bus on the ride home.
So ultimately, the girls who were responsible for threatening her, they were identified and interviewed, and they were determined to not be involved or responsible for Tina's murder.
After speaking with more classmates about Tina's movements, detectives are able to narrow down her timeline.
The geography teacher last sees Tina around 2:30 in the afternoon. At around 3 p.m., Weldon Mann and Todd Smith see Tina leaving the school area. It takes about 7 minutes to get from the high school to the culvert, and the truck driver spots Tina's body from the freeway at about 3:15.
I'm guessing probably around 3:05 is the time where Tina was assaulted and ultimately killed. And that makes it even more difficult to really process and comprehend that someone was able to do this in such a short time and not be seen.
To track down Tina's killer, detectives will need to piece together her final 24 hours.
One of the hardest parts of investigating this case for me was when I saw the autopsy photos. She was stabbed 44 times. She was alive for 33 of those stab wounds. Based upon the overkill, profilers would probably say that the suspect knew the victim. Usually, suspect doesn't have that much rage for a stranger.
Tina was stabbed multiple times in an obvious case of overkill. Overkill being defined as excessive violence that goes way beyond what's required to carry out the crime. In this case, there's a personal connection between the offender and the victim. This was somebody's rage boiling over, and that no number of stab wounds can be enough to fulfill the offender's need for vengeance.
Having established that Tina likely knew her killer, detectives speak with her mother, Shirley Fales. They hope she can provide more insight on who might have wanted to harm her daughter.
Remember that vividly. It was a Thursday. My sister usually got home about 3:30, and she wasn't home yet. And saw an undercover police car come down the court, and I just had a feeling it was coming to our house. Shirley was in complete little community.
Tina's mom, Shirley, had been divorced for about 2 years and was a single mom struggling to make ends meet.
At the time, Shirley was dating Bobby Youngworth, and he had actually moved into the Fales home. And Bobby had a tendency to get violent when he was drinking. At times, he would assault Shirley physically, and Tina didn't like that.
He was very abusive, a lot of yelling and fights. So it was pretty scary at times with him in the house.
Interestingly, to the investigators, about a week prior to Tina's murder, he and her had gotten into it. Tina definitely did not want Bobby living there, so it caused some major stress in that household. Bobby became a person of interest very quickly in the investigation.
I think at my young age, I even thought it could be him as well, too, because Tina would stick up for my mom when they'd be having arguments, and she wasn't afraid to stand up to him.
Could she have been threatening to tell her mother something that Bobby had done? Could she have given him some kind of ultimatum or been blackmailing him? Something that would have triggered this response. Not a response the victim could have ever imagined.
In the brutal stabbing of high school freshman Tina Fales, investigators have their first suspect, her mother's abusive boyfriend, Bobby Youngworth. Questioning if Bobby could have lashed out at Tina, detectives bring him down to the station for an interview.
Early on with investigators, he had denied any sort of temper or anything like that, but it definitely came out that he did have a temper, especially when he drank. He did get into it about a week prior with Tina, had gotten into a verbal argument with her, but he always held by the fact that he would never hurt her and genuinely cared about Tina.
Detectives ask Bobby for his timeline on the day of Tina's murder.
So Bobby worked in Fremont, California. He had taken the bus to work. He got on the bus about 2:30. He arrived at his place of employment around 2:45, and then went to the break room where he was observed until 3:15 prior to going to work. So when detectives went to verify Bobby's whereabouts, the boss informed detectives that while Bobby's at work, Shirley calls, and she notifies him that Tina's been killed. At that time, Bobby had a knife on his belt, that it would be a comfortable thing to take the knife to the Fales residence when he went there.
So investigators, of course, become interested in this detail and ask for the knife to be tested, but there was no DNA found.
Ultimately, investigators looked at the time to travel from Pleasanton to where he worked, and they determined that he couldn't possibly have committed the crime. He didn't fit the time parameters that we had established when Tina was killed.
So he was quickly dismissed as a suspect.
I think everyone was confused. Someone has taken this 14-year-old girl's life, and it was really hard to fathom who could be responsible. People were looking for closure. They didn't know, could it be my neighbor? Could it be someone that's going to kill again? And I think that was unsettling to people in the community at the time.
With the investigation now back at square one, detectives reach out to the community, hoping to find information that could lead to a potential suspect.
Investigators are doing a witness canvass. They become aware of some kids observing their activities on Lemonwood Way, which is where Tina was in the shortcut to. So investigators end up knocking on the door where the teenagers are seen. And who opens the door but a classmate of Tina's by the name of Steve Carlson.
The day that Tina was killed, Steve Carlson's parents were out of town.
He gives the investigators some information that he actually had seen Tina heading toward the culvert at about 3 p.m.
Realizing that Stephen could have been one of the last people to see Tina alive, police bring him down to the station for a formal interview.
On that particular day, Stephen invited some of his schoolmates to come to his house and have a party. They drank and used some drugs. At one point, Stephen returned to campus, and a couple students grabbed him, and they threw him in a dumpster.
He's actually locked in the dumpster for about 10 minutes or so before a woodshop teacher comes and lets him out. Steve Carlson is angry, he's covered in garbage, he's pissed off. The teacher tells him to head toward the principal's office. However, Steve Carlson walks the other way back to his house.
He told police at the time that he saw Tina going down towards the drainage canal around the time of her murder.
Steve Carlson also gives information to the investigators that he sees another classmate by the name of Jeff Michelson heading toward the culvert kind of a little bit after he sees Tina. He bullies other kids. He's even pulled out a pocket knife at school and kind of bragged that he has this knife. So Carlson really paints the picture that Jeff Michelson is a potential suspect in Tina's murder.
With suspicion swirling around Jeff Michelson, investigators bring him down to the station for questioning.
So on that particular day, April 5th, 1984, when Tina was murdered, Jeff Michelson attends detention. He is released from detention at 3 p.m. He is supposed to walk over to the elementary school and walk with his younger sister, but he's late. His sister ends up getting a ride from someone else.
And by the time he got home, it was 3:40 p.m. in the afternoon, and his mother questioned why he hadn't picked up his sister.
During the time of his murder, Jeff really doesn't have a solid alibi. There's no confirmation as to what exactly he was doing.
So that created more suspicion around Jeff and whether he could have been involved.
Then, Jeff tells detectives he goes to his job, working at a local pizza parlor, arriving at 5 p.m.
At the time of his interview, he had a cut on his hand and claimed that he'd cut his hand while working. That really led us to consider him rather strongly because of the violent nature of the stab wounds to Tina's body. We felt that it was a high probability that the suspect probably cut his hand.
When investigators are questioning Jeff Michelson, he admits to frequently carrying around a pocket knife. He produces that pocket knife to investigators, and investigators have that knife tested for the presence of any DNA.
With Jeff in their crosshairs, detectives request permission to search his bedroom.
Inside his bedroom is another knife that's found. It's a larger knife. It's contained within a sheath. So they end up confiscating the large knife that was found in his room, his pocket knife, the clothes that he was wearing that day. The more that time goes on, the stronger of a person of interest he becomes.
Here's a guy who's known to carry knives. Witnesses put him in the vicinity of the crime, and he has wounds on his hands. You add it all up, he immediately looks like a very viable suspect.
In the homicide of high school freshman Tina Fales, detectives are zeroing in on a prime suspect, the school bully, Jeff Michelson.
Jeff Michelson quickly becomes a strong person of interest based on the statement given by a classmate that
he was known to carry knives frequently, and ultimately detectives were able to take his knives and had them tested.
The DNA results from the knives from his clothing that he was wearing that day come back with no traces of DNA. So though he remained a person of interest, there was really no physical evidence to put him there at the scene.
With no new leads, the investigation into the murder of Tina Fales hits a wall.
It really turned this town upside down. Murders in Pleasanton were not common at all, much less that of a 14-year-old girl. The city was just scared to death at that time, and especially because the killer was still on the loose.
Then, police get a potential break in the case when an arrest is made for a separate crime.
Walter and I is arrested for a sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl. She was using a shortcut to leave school. He attempted to sexually assault her, and she ultimately got away. But the victim profile was the same as that of Tina Fales, which really piqued the investigators' interest.
Could Walter Nyman have killed Tina? He has a past sexual offense where he's engaged in following, potentially stalking, younger, female, similar in demographic profile to Tina. There's no sexual assault per se, but it could be the very act of stabbing someone repeatedly as an act of penetration that is arousing or has a sexual undertone to it.
With Walter Nyman already under arrest for sexual assault, detectives speak to his grandmother, hoping to learn more about his whereabouts in the hours leading up to Tina's death.
The odd thing about Walter Nyman is 5 days after Tina's murder, he suddenly shows up at his grandmother's house in Felton, California, out of the blue, and she said that he was visibly upset. He was not himself, that something seemed wrong with him.
Investigators obtain a search warrant for Walter Nyman's apartment in Pleasanton. When they enter his apartment, they end up locating bloodied clothes and a knife that's hidden in his apartment. The investigators thought this was going to be a huge break for them.
He looked like a really good suspect because of the similarities. He had suddenly left Pleasanton in a hurried manner. He shows up and commits a crime very similar to what transpired ultimately to Tina.
Investigators at this time are waiting on pins and needles to get the DNA results back because it's so
The results are that the blood on his clothing was animal blood. There was no DNA or anything consistent with Tina's murder on them.
For investigators, it was a huge disappointment. They just keep coming up empty-handed.
This was a heinous crime. Tina was robbed of her childhood. She was robbed of her innocence. You hope that you can follow through to the end and catch whoever the responsible individual is and make them pay for their crime.
With no new leads or suspects, the investigation into the murder of Tina Fales goes cold.
Investigators conducted 150 interviews of potential suspects, witnesses. Investigators are really at a standstill here of why and, more importantly, who.
Through the years, Shirley would contact police on the anniversary of Tina's death. Do you have anything new? Do you have any news for me? And that happened year after year after year.
It's really losing hope. I never thought it would get solved.
The psychological toll that this would take on the family, just day in, day out, it's just unfathomable to think that you have no answer in the case, that you don't know who did this to your daughter. It's got to be heart-wrenching.
"24 long years after Tina Fales' death, her killer remains at large. And each passing year leaves the community of Pleasanton with more questions than answers."
It was very difficult on my mom. It was always the topic of conversation. When the case went cold, my mom would do whatever she could to make sure it stayed fresh in everyone's mind. Contact the newspaper or check in with the police station. And I think it just slowly, mentally, she was deteriorating.
But in 2008, the case gets new life when Dana Savage, an up-and-coming detective with the Pleasanton PD, decides to take another look at Tina's file.
This case really spoke to me. Being a mom myself, I really felt for this family. When I was looking into this case, it was absolutely overwhelming. There was over 20,000 pages of police reports. I knew several of the investigators that had worked on this case exhaustingly, so I didn't have a whole lot of hope.
In the course of reviewing the case files, the tree above her head,
we seriously doubted that Tina was able to throw the person in the tree. She's defending herself. She's defending her life. Probably the threw it into the tree was the suspect, the only other person that was there.
I really was hopeful that I could get involved and somehow find that needle in the haystack that would break this case and solve it.
Knowing the odds are stacked against her, Detective Savage recovers Tina's purse, hoping it may be the key to solving this cold case.
When I take the purse out of evidence, there was nothing visible on the purse, no blood droplets, nothing like that.
The purse was sent to the FBI crime lab, and of course, being a cold case, it probably wasn't top priority.
Along with Tina's purse is a sample of her blood, and that is also sent to Quantico for testing. If anything is found on the purse, we can compare it to Tina's blood.
While awaiting results from the FBI, Dana starts combing through the case files, looking for anyone they could have potentially missed in 1984.
In the early 1980s, there were 3 serial killers that were around Pleasanton, California. I started focusing on these 3 suspects, which was James DiVeggio, Robert Rhodes, and Michael Ide. Michael Ide had raped and murdered Lisa Monzo in 1984. Lisa Monzo also fit the victim profile of Tina Fales, being a young Caucasian girl. Through the crime analyst, I learned that Michael Ide would have had an alibi for Tina's murder because he was incarcerated at the time.
Then Detective Savage discovers Robert Rhodes also has an airtight alibi for the day of Tina's murder, and he's eliminated as a suspect.
I then focus my attention on James DiVeggio and his girlfriend. They snatched Vanessa Sampson off the street around Pleasanton. They sexually assaulted her over a period of time before they murdered her. And interestingly enough, James DiVeggio attended Foothill High School. So James DiVeggio is serving life in prison. Investigators interview him. James DiVeggio says, "Look, I'm just going to level with you. I'm doing life anyway. I had nothing to do with the murder of Tina Fales. However, you might want to look into," and he names Walter Nyman. And I don't know how these people find each other, but James DiVeggio and Walter Nyman were friends and had hung out at a local bar in Pleasanton. Walter Nyman was the suspect who had sexually assaulted and grabbed a young girl 5 days following Tina's murder, even Tina Fales.
But in 1984, we didn't have any physical evidence to tie him to Tina, so unfortunately, things didn't pan out like we hoped that they would.
There is no honor among thieves. We have no idea if James DiVeggio is telling the truth, but now investigators are looking again at Walter Nyman.
And at that point, we have no physical evidence. Everything is speculation, so it's extremely frustrating because we're not able to determine who was responsible for this case.
It would take 2 more years before the FBI crime lab gets around to examining Tina Fales' purse for outside DNA.
There were so many suspects, many of whom had the potential and motive to have committed this homicide. The advancement of DNA technology has been very significant. So cases that years and years ago couldn't be tested can now be pinpointed to 1 in a trillion to the exact match of an individual who may have been on that suspect list.
At this point in the investigation, there's very high stakes in getting a DNA match on a suspect to move forward with this case.
Finally, the FBI lab criminologist is able to pinpoint 4 bloodstains on Tina's purse.
Once we receive the DNA results, only 1 comes back as not belonging to Tina. I receive a call, and it's Marty Parker from the FBI, and she says to me, "Do you want to know who killed Tina Fales?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." Once the DNA profile was located, that hit revealed a name that I definitely did not expect to hear again. The only viable sample was a nearly 100% match to male DNA belonging to Steve Carlson. Steve Carlson was Tina's older classmate from Foothill High School who had been scene watching the investigation as it was going on. He was also the one that told investigators that he saw Jeff Michelson following Tina into the culvert right before she was murdered. My first thought was shock. It's really hard for anyone, even an investigator, to wrap their mind around the fact that a kid can kill a kid.
After a 26-year investigation, Pleasanton detectives are closing in on the killer of high school freshman Tina Fales. Modern DNA testing has placed her classmate, Stephen Carlson, at the scene of the crime.
They didn't share the same social circles.
There was no other reason for his DNA to be at the scene of this murder unless he was the one that did it.
And that was an overwhelming feeling. Just disbelief that, wow, we really have something solid, concrete here now that ties him to the case.
In 1984, Steve Carlson was asked for an alibi, but he was more or less focused on as a potential witness, being that he had supposedly seen Jeff Michelson following Tina into that culvert.
At the time, we didn't have any physical evidence to tie him to Tina. There were no witnesses that tied him to the crime. It seemed so unlikely that he could be responsible for something so heinous.
26 years later, the DNA actually points to a fringe player that hadn't even been considered in the original investigation. This is like discovering a new planet, a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades.
With the discovery of physical evidence that places Stephen Carlson at the crime scene, detectives work to track him down, only to discover he's already in jail.
With fresh eyes on Steve Carlson, we re-interview witnesses. Steve Carlson's shop teacher knew of Steve's violent history. He said that following Tina's death, there definitely was a change in Steve Carlson's behavior. This information did not get back to investigators at the time, however.
Steve Carlson's name was Creepy Carlson. He was not well liked, he was a loner. We looked at the circumstances surrounding Tina's murder. Obviously, Stephen was there in the neighborhood the day she was killed. His home sat in a location where he could see her walk down into that drainage canal, walk through that fence. In fact, he at one point stated he saw Tina go down into that drainage canal.
Armed with this new information, investigators set out to interview Stephen Carlson at the Santa Cruz prison, where he is being held on an unrelated drug charge.
We're just here to talk.
We mentioned that we were detectives from Pleasanton and asked if he remembered a girl named Tina Fales.
You remember that? You were in high school. We're recontacting old photos from that case, and
Steve Carlson's body language completely changes. He starts almost throwing up at hearing her name. Kind of starts babbling incoherently.
I was doing so much acid back then, too.
Who were you friends with? Who did you hang out with in high school? Any kids in the neighborhood?
Mutters the name Jeff Michelson. He's just deflecting. He doesn't know. He wasn't involved.
Would you have a problem with providing a DNA sample?
For what?
I just asked you.
They have my DNA on file. Come on, man, I'm a felon. I'm a sex offender. They have all that. You guys should just do it all be down here for nothing. So we're going to talk to you.
Thankfully, investigators have a warrant for his DNA.
Detectives send Stephen Carlson's DNA sample to the crime lab to confirm it matches the sample found on Tina's purse.
And was confirmed as a match to Stephen Carlson. And ultimately, that's the piece of evidence that broke the case for us.
After 26 years, detectives are finally able to piece together Tina Fales' final 24 hours.
At 7:15 in the morning on the day that Tina's murdered, she's dropped off by her mom to avoid taking the school bus to avoid the bullies. At 8:05, Steve Carlson convinces 3 of his friends to come back to his house them and drink alcohol and use drugs. Steve and his friends returned to the school about 8:40 in the morning. At 10:10 a.m. at school, Jeff Michelson grabs Steve Carlson and throws him into the dumpster and locks him in. Steve Carlson gets out, he's covered in garbage, he's pissed off. He leaves school and he heads back home by himself and continues drinking. At 2:25, Tina finishes up geography class and visits with her teacher for about 5 or 10 minutes. Skips detention to avoid her bullies, and that's when she walks toward the culvert toward home. Steve Carlson sees Tina walking toward the culvert. He grabs a knife out of his own kitchen and follows her into the culvert.
So about 3:05 p.m., now intoxicated, enraged, he confronts her and assaults her, stabbing her ultimately 44 times.
Tina does her best to defend herself, but ultimately Steve Carlson just overpowers her. After attacking Tina, Steve Carlson throws her purse into the tree and then he throws the murder weapon. And that this 16-year-old kid would kill this young, sweet, innocent girl. But that's what happened. And it's because he's a psychopath and he's evil.
I think Steven wanted to unleash his rejection from peers, and he did that without any thought or concern for that victim. He's made a series of decisions to take out his pain on other victims who he can overpower, and that culminated in this homicide of Tina.
On August
wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover, and baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Welcome you back there again. Play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. I could bring my love now, baby. You make
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you, but to get a red wine and take it with a lead, I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the of the target.